Okay, here's something really interesting. Picture this. Washington, D.C., a new administration kicks off. Everyone's sort of expecting unity, at least initially.
Right, the usual post-inauguration honeymoon period, you might say.
Exactly. But then, bang, barely a week in, Vice President Vance, who's a Catholic convert, is suddenly, very publicly, at odds with the top American Catholic bishops.
Yeah, that initial harmony just, poof, evaporated almost overnight. It was quite striking how fast it happened.
Totally. And it wasn't behind closed doors either. This played out right in the open.
Which makes it even more significant, doesn't it?
Sure. So that's what we're digging into today, this clash, this specific conflict between Vice President Vance and the U.S. Catholic Church, zeroing in on, well, the really tough issue of immigration policy.
It's a flashpoint issue, definitely.
And we've pulled together quite a range of sources here: AP, American Magazine, Religion News Service, Sky News, Fox News, The Daily Beast, the USCCB itself, Politico, The Economic Times, even some Reddit threads.
And we're also weaving in some of the academic takes and, the theological concepts being thrown around in all this coverage.
Right. So our mission basically is to unpack this whole thing. What's the real disagreement here? What are the theological arguments each side is using? And, what are the bigger implications of this collision between faith and politics?
We really want to give you some clarity and context. Understand the substance behind the headlines, what's the reasoning? What does it mean when government and religious leadership clash so publicly?
Okay, let's dive right in then. So, less than a week after the inauguration, and remember, Cardinal Dolan had just given the invocation. Vance comes out with this pretty serious accusation.
Yeah, the timing is noticeable.
He basically says the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, the USCCB, is resettling illegal immigrants to get federal funding. That's, wow, quite a charge right off the bat.
It is. It suggests a fundamental disagreement right from the start, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Making a statement like that so soon.
No kidding.
Yeah.
And Cardinal Dolan, his response was just as direct. He didn't hold back.
Not at all.
He called Vance's words scurrilous, nasty, and flat out not true. He really pushed back hard against that idea of financial motive.
And he clarified the situation, didn't he? Explained the USCCB's actual role.
Yes, he pointed out they're just one of 10 groups legally resettling refugees, which is key under policies that have been around for decades. It's not some new underhanded thing.
Right, established legal processes.
Yeah.
And he tackled the money part, too.
Oh, yeah. He made it super clear the government grants don't even cover the costs. They rely heavily on private donations. He even joked about losing money on it, hand over fist.
Which really highlights how offensive they found the accusation, suggesting they're profiting from what they see as, well, a moral duty.
And he finished by saying he'd hoped for better from Vance. That adds a personal sting, doesn't it?
It certainly does. It shows the depth of the disappointment for the church leadership.
Okay, but Vance didn't just retract the statement. He actually leaned in further. He brought up this old Catholic theological idea, ordo amoris.
Ah, yes, the order of love. This is where it's really fascinating, moving beyond just policy into, ethics and interpretation.
Right. So Vance's take on ordo amoris is, well, pretty structured. He says it's a hierarchy. You start with family, then your neighbors, your local community.
Then fellow citizens.
And only then, after all those, do you look to people elsewhere. And he uses this to justify basically an America-first approach to immigration. Prioritize our own citizens.
But that interpretation isn't universally accepted within Catholic thought, is it?
Not at all. Our sources show quite a few scholars saying, hang on, that's a bit too simple, maybe even a misreading. They argue Catholic teaching actually stresses helping strangers, especially those in really desperate need.
It's a much more complex tradition than just a simple hierarchy.
Exactly. Look at someone like St. Augustine, way back. He sort of said, yeah, love everyone, but practically our capacity is limited, so we naturally focus care on those closer to us.
But that's about practical capacity, not necessarily a strict moral ranking that excludes others in need. There's nuance there.
Right. Then you've got St. Thomas Aquinas, centuries later. He agreed, obligations to family, to citizens, but, and this is key, he said circumstances matter.
The context element.
Yeah. He even gave this example. A stranger in, extreme danger might actually need your help more urgently than your own father, if the father's okay at that moment.
So need can override proximity or a relationship. That definitely challenges Vance's more rigid structure.
It really does. And there's a modern Jesuit theologian, David Hollenbach, who says Vance is basically getting Aquinas wrong. Hollenbach argues Aquinas meant we care most effectively for those near, sure, but if someone far away is in greater need...
That greater need takes precedence. It's about the level of urgency and suffering.
Hollenbach brings up the Good Samaritan parable, the outsider helps the guy left for dead after his own countrymen ignored him. He links this directly to refugees fleeing for their lives. Their need is extreme.
And that line of thinking seems much closer to Pope Francis's consistent message, doesn't it? Welcoming migrants, emphasizing their dignity.
Absolutely. And Pope Francis actually weighed in on this specific interpretation of ordo amoris. In a letter to the U.S. bishops back in February, he didn't name Vance, but, everyone knew who he was talking about.
What did he say exactly?
He said, Christian love is not a concentric expansion of interests. Basically, it's not just ever-widening circles starting from yourself.
So a direct counter to that hierarchical model. He offered a different vision.
Totally. He said the true ordo amoris is that which we discover by meditating on the parable of the Good Samaritan, a love that builds a fraternity open to all, without exception. Open to all, no exceptions.
Wow, that's a very clear theological rebuttal, placing universal fraternity and urgent need right at the center.
You'd think that might settle it, but no. Vance kept defending his view, went on Fox News, said the far left has got it backwards, inverted the order. He's sticking to his guns on this.
Which positions it not just as a theological interpretation, but as part of a wider ideological battle, it seems.
And he does have some defenders. R.R. Reno over at Compact backed Vance's reading. He even used that character from Dickens, Mrs. Jellyby.
Oh, right, the one obsessed with charity far away while her own home life is a mess.
That's her. Reno used her as an example of, misplaced priorities in love and care, focusing too far out when needs are closer.
It's a counter-argument worth noting, that tension between local and distant responsibilities.
But then you also hear from other bishops, like Bishop Burbage in Virginia. He stressed the dignity of every immigrant, regardless of status, but also said we need a common-sense approach, balancing care for strangers with national needs.
So clearly there isn't one single view, even among the bishops themselves. There's a spectrum of thought here.
Definitely. And this whole immigration fight isn't happening in a vacuum, right? It connects to other things going on.
Like the political context.
Yeah. Vance seems to have support from what's called the post-liberal movement. These are conservatives who think the government should, actively promote Christian values, not just be neutral. That lines up with some Trump administration goals.
So it fits into a broader political and philosophical project.
And then there are other divides among Catholics, big ones, like LGBTQ plus inclusion. You have Archbishop Broglio welcoming the administration, defining sex very traditionally, just male or female.
While others, like Cardinal McElroy, are calling for radical inclusion. And Cardinal Gregory even apologized for past church harms to LGBTQ plus people. Huge differences there.
Huge. It also came up that Vance quotes early church figures like Tertullian on religious freedom, arguing it's fundamentally a Christian concept tied to free will and dignity.
Trying to root current political stances in ancient Christian tradition. That's interesting.
Okay, let's shift to Vance's trip to the Vatican, April 19th, 2025. He meets Cardinal Parolin, the Secretary of State, and Archbishop Gallagher, the Foreign Minister.
Right, high-level meetings.
The official Vatican statement afterwards was, very diplomatic. Talked about an exchange of opinions, mentioned migrants, refugees, prisoners specifically, and hoped for serene collaboration.
Standard Vatican speak, perhaps. Acknowledging discussion, hoping for cooperation, even amid disagreements. They also acknowledged the Church's work with the vulnerable in the U.S.
But Vance's office apparently put a slightly different spin on it. They talked more about shared faith, persecuted Christians, Trump's peace efforts, less focus on the migration issue.
So different emphasis in the readouts. That often signals that the core disagreements probably weren't fully resolved.
And then the surprise detail emerged. Vance had a quick and private meeting with Pope Francis himself at the Pope's residence.
Oh, really? Because the Pope had been ill. Right. There was talk he might not attend the main meeting.
Exactly. But they met privately. No word on what they actually talked about, though.
Still, the fact the meeting happened, even briefly and privately, suggests the Vatican saw it as important to have that direct contact, despite the very public tensions.
And just before the visit, Cardinal Parolin had given this interview, stressing multilateralism, diplomacy, cooperation things, maybe not always top of the list for the Trump administration.
Setting out the Vatican stall. so to speak.
Yeah.
Laying down their principles.
Yeah, and he specifically mentioned Ukraine and Gaza, saying you can't just annihilate another people or deny their right to land. Pretty pointed comments in that context.
Clearly signaling the Vatican's stance on major international issues, which would frame their conversation with Vance.
And we have to remember Pope Francis himself has been incredibly critical of Trump's immigration policies before, called them a disgrace, a major crisis. His February letter just doubled down on the dignity of migrants.
He's been remarkably consistent and outspoken on this. It's a defining issue for his papacy, which creates this undeniable friction point.
Vance, for his part, acknowledges the criticism. He's even called himself a baby Catholic, still learning. But he hasn't backed down on his policy views.
So acknowledging the Pope's authority, perhaps, but standing firm on his political stance, that's a tricky balancing act.
And finally, there's the wider power shift in D.C., isn't there? Biden and Pelosi are gone. Trump's nominated a conservative activist, Brian Birch, as Vatican ambassador.
Right, while at the same time, Pope Francis appointed the more progressive Cardinal McElroy in Washington, D.C. itself.
Yeah, McElroy was appointed to San Diego, but Francis elevated him to cardinal, giving him a significant voice often heard in D.C. circles, contrasting with the archbishop there. It really sets an interesting stage for how the U.S. government and the Catholic Church are going to interact going forward.
Definitely signals potentially different dynamics and perhaps ongoing tensions.
So wrapping this up, what we've seen is this really significant, very public tension blow up incredibly quickly between a top U.S. official and his own church leadership.
Right, centering on Vance's accusations about funding, which the bishops flatly denied, and crucially, these fundamentally different ways of reading ordo amoris, this core theological concept.
With Pope Francis himself offering a very direct counterinterpretation to the vice president's view, and all this playing out alongside these other big divides within the church on social issues.
It leaves us with some big questions, doesn't it?
It really does. Like, what does this kind of public clash between politics and faith leaders really tell us about how religion influences policy today? Or maybe how policy tries to influence religion?
And how do you even navigate interpreting these ancient theological ideas like ordo amoris in today's supercharged political world?
Yeah, and for someone like Vance, how do you square your personal faith commitments with your political duties when they seem to point in such different directions? It's something to think about, maybe dig into those theological ideas a bit more yourself after listening.